I'm going to be the first negative speaker. My opponent talked about how thousands basically die, or Islamists are under the Assad regime. Now, Islamists, as we know, is another term for extremists. And in both the Assad regime and in the rebel regime, both have extremists. The fact of the matter is that this war is a civil war, and in all war, death is inevitable, whether it is in World War I, World War II, so on and so forth. So the only thing that can be done is to help those who are alive and suffering. So I feel that the best solution, or best resolution, would be to try and establish peace treaties in order to stop further conflict and to prevent more deaths. Mr. Anand said, or one of the, from the Globe and Mail, said he still believes that violence can be subdued through negotiation and mediation, pointing to a planned peace conference next month backed by both the United States and Russia as hope, as long as the world unites behind it. This idea was going back and forth based on the conflict in Algeria. So he basically was involved in that problem and is trying to find a resolution towards the civil war. In the same article, the Globe and the Mail, countries should have held talks on establishing a transitional government in a few months to ease Mr. al-Assad's out, rather than pointing fingers at each other and calling each other names, he said. That's not leadership. So under the regime, what they should have done is they should have helped kind of organize a way to kick him out, because it's very difficult to move someone who's a dictator out of a regime. There must be some slow organization to kind of pull the individual out. Also for the same Globe and Mail, some would argue that the violence has already begun to spill into communities in Lebanon and Iraq. Mr. Anand said, and the risk of fighting between Arab and Sunnis and Kurdish forces could drag in Turkey, and it has increased tensions between Iran and the Gulf nations and deepened divisions between Sunni and Shia. The major conflict, as he said, is also between the government and the people. But what we don't know is that the government is actually a Shiite-controlled government, and the rebels are the Sunnis. Most of the conflicts within the Middle East are basically based on the power struggle between the Sunnis and the Shiites. For a second claim, he talks about training troops how to fight and how it could in fact be a benefit to the United States. This can go both ways. It could be a benefit, but the more likely risk is that it's a potential risk rather than a benefit. For the RT News, foreign German minister Guido Westerwelle stressed that the Syrian opposition must distance itself from terrorist and extremist forces. So I would say it is better to continue a current policy, such as basically providing humanitarian aid to Syria. In Reuters.com, it talks about how Washington has given $385 million in humanitarian aid for Syria, but the U.S. President Obama has so far refused to give arms, arguing it is difficult to prevent them from falling into the hands of militants who could use them on Western targets. So for both sides, he thinks it is possible that either extremists from the Assad regime or from the rebels could misuse the arms that they provide. So they believe it is better to provide humanitarian aid that is non-lethal to the people. Another type of humanitarian aid under Reuters, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said that the United States would for the first time provide assistance in form of medical supplies and the standard U.S. ration known as meals ready to eat, or MRES, to fighters. Because of the war, most of the shops and kind of like the circulation of food and water has kind of been damaged due to the building destruction. So it is necessary to provide them with food, water, whatever resources necessary. By providing supplies to the U.S. helps not only the rebels, but also the civilians who are involved. Under Reuters, the European Union is acting on the decision to send direct aid to the rebels, said it had amended sanctions on Syria to permit the supply of armored vehicles, non-lethal military equipment, and technical aid, provided they were intended to protect civilians. So here we see that they also provide kind of like armored tanks, kind of like those shields they use for like police shields, and non-lethal weapons for their protection. So in fact, the U.S. does provide them with the raw materials to defend themselves. For the third claim, we should not assume that they will be of benefit to us if they might abuse our trust. Under the New York Times, it says that there are fake Syrian army brigades claiming to be revolutionaries, and when they get the weapons, they sell them in trade, said by Mr. Aboud. Without putting our troops in danger, we can instead have airstrikes, and will at least put the rebels at equal grounds with Assad's troops and put the troops in risky situations. Vice President John McCain, one of the top Republicans, or not, one of the senators, John McCain, also Armed Services Committee, wants U.S. airstrike on Syrian government aircraft and weapons, but is against sending the American ground troops. So there's an alternative solution without incorporating our own or without introducing our own troops into the war. It is better to have an airstrike and prevent our troops from falling in, or from being in danger. Okay, I'll just end up there.